Several of you have been sending me your child-free stories, and today, with permission, I'm going to be sharing one of those child-free stories with you. Here's the story in their own words. My journey through the child-free life. It won't be pretty at times, so don't say I didn't warn you. By way of introduction, I am a man rapidly approaching 70 years of age. My wife and I have been married for 45 years. Though some might think that's amazing, there's no one more amazed than myself. I still shake my head some days and wonder how or why she has put up with me for so long. I'm not the easiest person to live with. My wife and I met in the mid-1970s. I'd been working for a few years, but had been bouncing from job to job. She was just completing college. Neither one of us had been in relationships with any long-term potential. I was approaching my mid-20s and thought that maybe I just wasn't the type to settle down. Though that may seem strange today, there were others in my age group that were getting married just or not long after graduating from high school. My future wife and I met in early March, bumped into each other again in late May, were engaged in August, and married in late April of the following year. Love at first sight? Possibly, but instant mutual attraction and respect was definitely at play. Looking back to before we were engaged, my soon-to-be fiancé asked a question of which I failed to grasp the implications. The question went something like this: "What do you think about children?" My reply was, "I guess I'd make some kid an okay dad." I'm sure she read that as me wanting to have kids sometime in the future. Having never been in a serious relationship up to that point, I'd never given the whole kids no kids scenario much thought. I found out much later that my wife had wanted several, or at least 3, children from the time of her mid-teens. Fast forward about 8 or 9 years from our first meeting, and my wife was established in her career and had advanced as far as she could without becoming a manager, of which she had no desire. In her mind, it was time to think of adding children to the family. I, on the other hand, was still fighting my way up a very high and slippery career pole, and it would be another 15 years or more before I would consider my career a moderate success personally and financially. In my mind, we were coasting along just fine, paying down our mortgage, which in the late 70s, early 80s was at an interest rate of 10% or higher, taking the odd inexpensive vacation, and saving a bit each year for retirement. I recently heard it theorized that women's biological clocks don't really exist, and it's more of a sociological phenomenon due to colleagues, friends, or family members having children. Regardless, my dear wife was getting anxious to have children of her own. To say the least, I was not enamored at the prospect of being a dad. I'm sure I didn't possess the maturity, patience, and if I'm being honest, the mental stability to raise a child. I know myself well enough and know that I might be described as tightly wound. To have children or not have children is one of those digital decisions in life. No halfway, no middle ground. I was content with just the 2 of us. Sharing my wife with 1, 2, or maybe more persons did not appeal in the slightest. The prospect of having our relationship change with the inclusion of a child was not a scenario my mind could even remotely entertain. The thought of a crying, defecating, totally demanding infant in the house made me shudder. Further in the future, the thought of a sullen teenager with raging hormones? No thanks. The constant tension of the possibility of having a kid go wrong on drugs and alcohol? Not for me. Many heart-rending discussions over a period of 3 or 4 months nearly broke up our marriage. There was also a pregnancy scare thrown in for good measure, which totally freaked me out. So strong were my feelings that I told my wife if she wanted to leave our marriage and pursue another relationship that could give her what she wanted, I would not stand in her way. My feelings against parenthood were that strong. At one point in the baby discourse, she said, "You lied. You told me you wanted children." Note the innocent question before we were engaged. My reply, which I don't think she believed at the time, was, "It seemed like an okay idea someday, but for me someday hasn't happened and I can't see it ever happening." Fortunately for me, my wife loved me enough that she was able to forego her dreams of motherhood. I, in my insensitiveness, couldn't see that over the following months she was mourning the loss of the child she would never have. I know that it is beneficial to forgive oneself, but I still wrestle with the pain and heartache I caused my loving wife. A few months after this seismic event, my wife was taken ill with a chronic autoimmune disease. She was very ill for several months and even taken to the hospital for 10 days at one point. Medication has controlled her symptoms, and for the last 35 years, she has lived an almost normal life with only the occasional flare-up. Considering the nature of her illness, she has been more fortunate than most that suffer from the same disease. At the time of her initial illness, my wife said she was glad we didn't have kids. She was barely well enough to take care of herself, let alone a child as well. Some might think I got my way and got away child-free. I don't think of it in terms of a win or a loss. Life throws some curveballs, but it's how you deal with them and move on that matters. At least that's my 2-cent philosophy. The question that I often ponder is, why am I the way that I am? I don't dislike children, but I don't want to hold people's babies. I do think that people who take young children on airplanes are evil, and people that take infants and toddlers on airplanes are pure evil. Self-analysis is probably fraught with error, but I'll have a go at it nonetheless. I am the oldest of 3 siblings. I truly have sympathy for oldest siblings. We bear the brunt of our parents' early experiments in child rearing. I grew up in a caring household, but it had a pervading emotional chilliness. I'll definitely say there was never any PDA between my parents. I'm assuming there was some DA, but I can hardly think of a time when I saw my parents actually touch each other. I am, however, willing to cut them a lot of slack. They were born in the 1920s, and their lives were shaped by the Great Depression and World War II. They both had fathers that would be considered very deficient by today's standards. If I may digress slightly here, let me say that my paternal grandmother had 4 sons in the armed forces during World War II, and at least 3 of them, my father included, served overseas. My dad's younger brother lied about his age and joined the Navy when he was 16. I know the pandemic that we lived through has caused a lot of suffering, loss, and pain, but I can't imagine how my grandmother was able to get out of bed each morning for 6 years, knowing that she might get a message that day that one of her sons had been killed. I'm in awe at the mental toughness she possessed. I think she and my mom had a lot in common, which would explain why my mom never really liked her. The people of my parents' age have been called the greatest generation because of the hardships they endured and the sacrifices they made. My father, who as a youth at times had been emotionally mistreated by his father, did his best to be fair and patient with all 3 of us kids, and he generally succeeded. My mother had her favorite. I guess I had always known, but what you grow up with is what you get used to and you don't think about it much. I did kind of call out my mom on it once in my late teens. My wife clued in right away, and when she mentioned to me, the realization dawned that it had always been like that from essentially day one. Whenever the favorite sibling entered the room or spoke, the light would come on in my mom's eyes. Now some of you might be thinking, wow, first world problems, what a crybaby. It was what it was, and I can kind of understand it. I was the shy, awkward introvert. The favorite child was the confident, bubbly extrovert, and in many ways a lot like my mom. Did this predispose me to not wanting children of my own? Who's to say? It's likely the old nature versus nurture argument. My mother, who was caring in many ways, was also, as I later came to realize, very controlling and manipulative. There were no outright lies as such, but to get her way or manipulate the outcome of a situation would obfuscate and did not hesitate to be very economical with the truth at times. My parents were of a different generation, and they wanted to give us what they didn't have growing up. They wanted us to have more of the material things that they could have only dreamed of when they were young. As well, I think they wanted us to be free of the anxieties they had in their youth. I can't deny that isn't a good goal, but perhaps the hardships they endured brought a certain steeliness and resolve to their parenting style, and also a bit too much of a controlling nature as well. Our household was straight out of a 1950s TV show. Dad worked and Mom was a homemaker. Any life questions of a delicate nature were met with embarrassment on my mother's part, and usually had a good dose of judgment and on occasion outrage thrown in for good measure. I quickly learned to just not ask. When I was in my early 20s, my mother and I shared a rare heart-to-heart conversation. She stated that my father initially didn't want children, but she convinced him otherwise. Later, after I was married, my mother and I were having a disagreement. Somehow, the subject of children, specifically grandchildren, had come up, but I wasn't buying into her point of view. One trait I've noticed about manipulative people is that when their controlling ways are no longer effective, they may say or do something nasty to try and reassert control. On this occasion, my mother said she wished she had never had children. Nice, huh? A few years later, she denied this conversation, but by the look on her face, I knew she had remembered. She had a memory like an elephant, especially when someone crossed her. I don't want to seem ungrateful or vindictive. My parents were who they were, tried their best, and for the most part succeeded in raising 3 children. My siblings and I are all hardworking, successful, and happy with our lots in life. Would I change anything about my life? For the most part, no, except I should have worked harder and gotten better grades in school. I think I was closer to my father, but my mother and I had a better understanding of each other, and our relationship reached a certain détente. I used to joke with her in later years that I could easily hang guilt trips on people because I'd learned from a pro. We'd share a laugh over that observation. If I have one regret, it's that I didn't thank my mother enough for the good things she did for us, and I took her for granted at the time. Neither my parents nor my wife's parents in any way pressured us, let alone barely even mentioned us supplying them with grandchildren. They knew that if they had, a terse, mind your own business would have been the reply. Others had already supplied them with the requisite grandchildren to spoil, so perhaps the pressure was off us in that regard. From the time my wife and I were engaged, both my mom and dad were very taken with her. It was as if she was the daughter they never had. My wife and dad would tease each other all the time, and my dad especially loved it. It was a sweet and charming dynamic that I didn't give much thought to until mentioned by my mother. So, did my chilly upbringing in a house dominated by coercion, manipulation, and almost lies make me into a child-adverse adult? Who's to say? I can't look back on my childhood and say that it was particularly fun. There are many who could say the same, especially my parents. A friend of a friend, upon hearing that I didn't have children, asked if I was happy being childless. My reply was 95% yes and 5% no. It was a rather curious question from a person with children from whom he is virtually estranged. My wife and I have been retired for several years. She retired in her late 50s after a very rewarding career in the healthcare field. I retired in my early 60s. We built our dream home 20 years ago, and though we're not wealthy by any stretch of the imagination, we don't have to worry about where our next meal is coming from or if we can pay our monthly bills. We both enjoy decent health and love winter getaways to warmer climates. I don't think my wife and I are selfish. We donate to our local hospital and hospice and to an international charity that helps women and children in the third world. We have helped relatives and friends from time to time with small gifts of cash to see them through a tight spot. We are also generous with our time helping friends and relatives with construction and renovation projects. We know many people with fine children, but it seems that there are many these days that refuse to grow up. Living in your parents' basement was not a thing when I was young. Almost everyone then couldn't wait to leave home. At times, my wife and I consider ourselves lucky that we dodged the whole children thing. We know or know of people who have children that have ambitionless partners more interested in smoking pot and coasting through life. The brother of a former work colleague lost a child to a fentanyl overdose. I can't imagine the heartbreak that caused. All in all, life has been mostly kind to me. One thought did pop into my head recently. Have my wife and I denied this amazing experience we call life by not sharing it with another child or children of our own? Like I said at the beginning, childlessness is a journey, at least for me at any rate. I think that journey is something that people with children might misunderstand. We, the childless, have a journey too. It's not always just turning a corner without a backward glance.